The day they read my grandfather's will was the day the town of Redemption decided I was a fool. I was 18, orphaned for as long as I could remember, and stood in the dusty solicitor's office with my hands clasped so tight my knuckles were bone white. The solicitor, a man whose face seemed permanently pinched from delivering bad news, cleared his throat and read the final, damning bequeathment. To his sole surviving granddaughter, he left his only worldly possession of note, the deed to a forsaken piece of land known colloquially as the Dust Moor. A wave of stifled laughter rippled through the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered for the spectacle. Mr. Thorne, the town's most prosperous rancher, a man whose wealth was measured in cattle and contempt, let out a low chuckle that sounded like rocks grinding together. The Dust Moor, he drawled, his voice thick with derision. The old man finally lost his mind. What's she to do with a hole in the ground? Raise lizards. The Dust Moor wasn't just land, it was a scar on the earth, a deep and treacherous canyon with sheer rock walls that baked under the sun. It was said nothing grew there but misery, and the only water it ever saw was the flash flood that would scour it clean every decade or so. It was utterly, unequivocally useless. Later that day, the solicitor handed me a heavy, iron-bound trunk. This was with the deed, he said, his expression a mixture of pity and professional detachment. The key is attached. It was a strange, ornate key, heavy in my palm. It felt less like an object and more like a question. That night, I sat on the floor of my small, rented room, the trunk before me like a silent tomb. The town's judgment echoed in my ears. A useless girl inheriting a useless canyon. It was a perfect, miserable symmetry. But as my fingers traced the cold iron bands of the trunk, I felt a flicker of something else, something that wasn't shame. It was the last piece of him I had left. The last piece of a man who had spent his life prospecting for something no one else could see, a man who saw value where others saw only waste. I turned the key. The lock groaned open with a sound like a final breath. Inside, there was no gold, no hidden currency, only the dry, earthy scent of old paper and canvas. The trunk was filled with his journals, dozens of them, bound in cracked leather and filled with his spidery, determined script. Beneath them lay a collection of small canvas sacks, each tied with twine and marked with symbols I didn't recognize. And under it all, a series of rolled-up charts, not of mining claims or geological surveys, but of the Dust Moor itself. I unrolled the largest one on the floor. It was a map unlike any I had ever seen. It didn't show elevation in the way a surveyor would, but with intricate, swirling lines that followed the layers of rock. There were symbols marking specific spots along the canyon walls, symbols that corresponded to the sacks of seeds. One journal, dated 20 years prior, fell open. His handwriting was an anchor in the swirling sea of my confusion. They look for veins of gold, he wrote. They blast the rock and curse its stubbornness. They don't understand. The rock isn't the vault. The rock is the vessel. The real treasure isn't in it, it's through it. I spent a week doing nothing but reading. I moved from my rented room to a small, abandoned shack on the edge of town, closer to the canyon. The town watched me go with a collective shrug. Let the fool girl play in her fool's canyon. I devoured his words, his observations, his theories. He wrote about the sun, not as an enemy, but as an engine. He wrote about the wind, not as a thief of topsoil, but as a sculptor and a seed-bearer. And he wrote about water. He was obsessed with it. The desert doesn't lack water, one entry read. It hides it. It holds it deep in the stone, in porous layers shielded by impenetrable ones. You don't dig down for it. You listen for it. You follow the memory of it. His maps were a guide to that memory. The strange lines weren't rock strata, they were what he called seepage lines, ancient pathways where water had once flowed and might still weep, trapped behind millennia of settled rock and earth. The inheritance was not the land. It was the knowledge of the land. My first journey into the Dust Moor felt like a descent into the planet's core. The air grew thick and still, the sun beating down on the red rock walls until the heat radiated invisible waves. The silence was absolute, broken only by the skittering of a lizard or the crunch of my own boots on the gravelly floor. It was a place of profound emptiness. I carried one of his maps and a pickaxe, feeling small and utterly absurd. I found the first symbol from his chart, a small, painted circle on a section of wall that looked no different from any other. According to his journal, this was a weeping point. I saw nothing. No dampness, no discoloration, just sun-blasted stone. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced the fragile bubble of my hope. Thorn's mocking voice echoed in the oppressive silence. Raising lizards. But I remembered my grandfather's words, you don't dig down. You follow the memory. I pressed my hand against the rock. It was hot to the touch, solid, unyielding. I took out the pickaxe. The first swing sent a jarring shock up my arms. The sound was pathetic, a tiny tick that the canyon swallowed whole. I kept at it for hours, my hands blistering, my back screaming in protest. The sun crawled across the sky, turning the canyon from a furnace into a shadow-filled crypt. The townspeople would have laughed themselves sick if they could see me, a lone girl chipping away at a mountain. Just as I was about to give up, to let the crushing reality of the place defeat me, something changed. A small piece of the rock face flaked away, and behind it, the stone was dark. Not just dark, but cool. And damp. A thrill, electric and fierce, shot through me. I worked with renewed frenzy, no longer caring about the pain. I scraped and dug, following the line of moisture, and then I saw it. A single, glistening drop of water welling up from the rock and tracing a slow, hesitant path downwards. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was a promise. It was everything. That single drop of water became my life's work. I spent the next year following the map, following the hidden language of the stone. My grandfather's journals were my only teacher. He explained how to read the subtle changes in the rock's texture, how a certain crystalline formation often indicated a pressure point where water was held captive. He instructed me not to blast, but to chisel, to gently relieve the pressure and allow the ancient springs to be reborn. I discovered 3 more seeps, each one a little stronger than the last, until I reached the spot he had marked with a star. The heart, his journal called it. Where the mountain holds its breath, it was behind a massive rockfall at the far end of the canyon, a place choked with debris. It took me 6 months to clear it. I moved rocks one by one, my muscles hardening, my skin turning the color of the earth. The people of Redemption saw me only when I came into town for supplies, my face smudged with dust, my clothes torn. They would shake their heads. Poor thing, I heard a woman whisper to Mr. Abram at the general store. The sons cooked her mind, I ignored them. They saw a girl fighting a rock pile, I was on the verge of liberating a river. The day I moved the final boulder, a low gurgling sound echoed from the darkness behind it. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. A trickle of water emerged, then another, and another, converging into a steady, clear stream that flowed out over the rocks and onto the canyon floor. It wasn't a flood, not a torrent, but it was constant. It was life. Cold, sweet water, filtered through a mile of stone. I knelt and plunged my hands into it, letting the impossible coolness wash over my skin. I wept, not from sadness, but from a sense of profound, earth-shattering victory. The Dustmore had a pulse. And I was the one who had found it. The canyon was no longer a tomb. It was a cradle. With water, the impossible became merely difficult. The floor of the canyon was stone and gravel, useless for planting. But my grandfather had foreseen this. His journals contained detailed instructions for a process he called soil making. It was alchemy, not agriculture. I used the stream to create a series of settling pools, capturing the fine silt that washed down from the rock. I chiseled away at softer sandstone, grinding it into fine dust rich with minerals. I gathered the tough, scraggly brush that grew in the cracks and crevices of the upper canyon, composting it in shaded pits until it became a rich, dark humus. My life became a rhythm of grinding, carrying, and mixing. I built low stone walls, creating terraces that climbed the lower slopes of the canyon walls, preventing my precious new earth from being washed away. Each terrace was a testament to 1,000 journeys, 1,000 buckets of silt, dust, and compost, all mixed by hand and laid down like a sacred offering. 2 years passed like this. 2 years of sun and stone and silence. The town had mostly forgotten me, writing me off as a lost cause. Samuel, a kind-eyed rancher who sometimes grazed his herds near the canyon's rim, would occasionally stop and watch me. He never mocked. He just watched, his brow furrowed in thought. One day, he called down to me, his voice echoing in the vast space. "What are you building down there, girl?" I looked up, shielding my eyes from the sun. I looked at my first completed terrace, a patch of earth so black and rich it looked like a piece of the night sky laid on the red ground. "A garden," I called back. He was silent for a long time. Then I heard him say, mostly to himself, "I'll be damned," he was the first person whose doubt began to fracture. He saw not a mad girl, but a method. He saw the slow, deliberate creation of a world. The patch of black earth was no bigger than a kitchen table, but to me, it was a continent. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one written not in stone, but in soil. The time had come to plant. I opened the small canvas sacks my grandfather had left me. The seeds inside were strange, varied in shape and color, none of them familiar. His journal explained they were heirlooms, seeds he had collected and bred over decades, specifically for this place. Drought-resistant corn with deep roots, tomatoes that thrived in intense heat, beans that could draw nutrients from mineral-rich soil, squash that grew on sprawling, hardy vines. He had been preparing this ark for years. I pushed the first seed into the dark, manufactured earth of my terrace. It felt like a prayer. I watered them with the clean, cold water from the spring, watching over the small plot with fierce devotion. And then, life. Tiny green shoots pushed their way through the soil, fragile and yet defiant. They grew with a speed and vitality that stunned me. The canyon, which had for so long been a palette of red and brown, was now slashed with vibrant green. The plants flourished in the sheltered microclimate, protected from the harsh winds by the high walls and nourished by the constant sun and reliable water. The harvest was a miracle. The tomatoes were deep red and heavy, bursting with a flavor so intense it was almost shocking. The corn was sweet, the beans tender. This wasn't just survival, this was abundance. I loaded a basket and made the long walk into town. I went straight to Mr. Abrams' general store. He looked at my offering, his eyes widening. "Good heavens," he murmured, picking up a tomato that was nearly the size of his fist. "Where on earth did you grow this?" His question hung in the air, filled with a dawning understanding. He knew there was only one place I could have grown it. "In the canyon," I said quietly. He looked from the vibrant vegetable in his hand to my dusty, determined face. He was a practical man, a man who dealt in facts and figures. And the fact was, he was holding impossible fruit, grown in an impossible place. He bought the entire basket without another word. The payment felt heavier than coin, it felt like validation. The whispers in town began to change, from pity to curiosity, from curiosity to a grudging, bewildered respect. The single terrace became 10. The garden climbed the canyon wall, a staircase of green against the red stone. The income from selling my produce to Mr. Abram was small but steady, and I saved every penny. It was time for the next phase of my grandfather's vision. "The land must give back," he wrote. "The plants feed the soil, the animals feed the plants. I needed livestock. I used my savings to purchase a small herd of hardy cattle, chosen for their resilience. But this presented the greatest challenge yet. The dustmoor was inaccessible. There was no path, no road, just a sheer drop of several hundred feet. The canyon that had protected my garden now threatened to become its prison. Once again, I turned to the journals. Tucked into the back of the very last one was a map I had overlooked, a map not of the canyon's floor, but of its rim. It showed a series of complex switchbacks, a hidden path that snaked its way down a collapsed section of the western wall. "Nature does not favor straight lines," he had written beside it. "The path of least resistance is often hidden." It took me a month to find it. The entrance was completely obscured by a thicket of thorny brush and a clever rockslide, deliberately placed. It was a gate only someone with the key, the map, could open. I cleared the path, stone by stone, branch by branch. It was narrow, steep, and treacherous, but it was viable. It was a secret door into my hidden world. The day I led my small herd down that winding path was a second victory, as profound as the discovery of the water. As the cattle stepped onto the canyon floor and began to graze on the tough grasses I had cultivated near the stream, the system felt complete. The farm was no longer just a garden, it was a self-contained ecosystem, a world unto itself, hidden from the eyes of the surface. I had built a farm no one could reach, not because they weren't able, but because they had never known to look for the door. 7 years after I inherited the dust moor, the sky turned against us. A great drought settled over the territory like a shroud. The rain stopped. The creeks dried up, the water table dropped, and the wells in Redemption began to run low. The grass on the open plains turned brown, then crumbled to dust. The air was thick with it, a constant haze that burned the eyes and coated the back of the throat. I watched it from my canyon, a world away. Down on my farm, the hidden spring, fed by an aquifer deep within the mountain, flowed as steadily as ever. My terraces remained green. My cattle grew fat and healthy on fodder I grew and stored. I was an island of life in a dying sea of dust. The ranchers were the first to be hit. Their herds, once a sign of wealth and power, became a liability. The price of feed skyrocketed, and there was no water to be had. I saw Samuel one day, standing at the canyon's edge, his shoulders slumped. He looked older, worn down by the relentless sun. "It's all gone," he said, his voice raspy. "Everything is burning up, but Thorne's herds were hit the hardest." He had more cattle than anyone, and his arrogance had not allowed him to prepare. Rumors in town said he was losing dozens a day. His empire, built on the open range, was being dismantled by an empty sky. One afternoon, I saw a figure making his way towards the canyon rim. It was Thorne. He looked diminished, his confident stride replaced by a weary shuffle. He stood at the edge, looking down at the impossible green of my farm, at the healthy cattle grazing by the stream. The contrast between my world and his was stark and brutal. He did not speak for a long time. The silence was filled with the lowing of my cows and the rustle of corn leaves. Finally, his voice, stripped of all its former arrogance, drifted down. "How?" he asked. It was a single word, but it contained a universe of defeat, of confusion, of broken pride. "You told me it was a useless hole in the ground," I called back, my voice even, not with triumph, but with a quiet certainty. He had no reply. He came to me a week later, not at the rim, but at the secret entrance to the path, which Samuel had quietly shown him. He was a changed man. The drought had scoured away his pride, leaving behind something raw and desperate. He asked to buy water, to buy feed, to lease grazing land on the canyon floor. He offered a price that was staggering, a price that would have made me one of the wealthiest people in the territory. He expected me to bargain, to gloat, to exact revenge for the years of mockery. I did none of those things. I looked at this man, who had once defined my worth by the uselessness of my inheritance, and I saw only a man trying to survive. "The water is not for sale," I told him. A flicker of his old anger returned to his eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by despair. "But your animals can drink from the lower pools," I continued. "And I will sell you feed at a fair price." "The same price I give Mr. Abram." He was stunned into silence. He had come prepared for a battle of wills, but I was offering a truce. He didn't understand mercy when it wasn't transactional. But my grandfather's journals weren't just about geology and botany, they were about systems, about balance. Hoarding my abundance while the world outside withered would make my sanctuary a fortress, but it would also make it a prison. A healthy system engages with its surroundings. It gives as well as takes. Thorne accepted my terms, his voice a hoarse whisper. As his gaunt cattle were led down the secret path, the town of Redemption finally understood. The fool girl in the useless canyon had not just survived, she had built the ark. She had listened to the rock, and it had given her the keys to life itself. I would often sit on the highest terrace in the evenings, looking at the farm that had grown from a single drop of water and a handful of seeds. I would reread my grandfather's journals, and now I understood his final entries. He had never been looking for gold. He knew the real wealth wasn't a shiny metal you could dig up and spend, but the resilient, regenerative power of life itself. He wasn't a failed prospector. He was a prophet. He had seen the brittleness of the world they were all building on the surface and had spent his life creating an alternative, a blueprint for a world that worked with the earth, not against it. He hadn't left me a canyon. He had left me a legacy of seeing. He taught me to look at a wasteland and see a reservoir, to look at a struggle and see a lesson, to look at a burden and see the seed of a future no one else could imagine. The drought eventually broke. The rains returned, and the land slowly began to heal. But the world had changed. The balance of power had shifted. The old certainties, measured in acres and head of cattle on the open range, had been revealed as fragile. The true measure of wealth, they learned, was resilience. It was the ability to thrive when the world fell apart. My farm became more than just a farm. It became a seed bank, a source of knowledge. People came not to mock, but to learn. They asked about the terraces, about the soil, about the strange and wonderful plants that grew with such vigor. I taught them what my grandfather had taught me, to observe, to listen, and to understand the deep, slow systems that govern the world. I never sought power or acclaim. I had my grandfather's quiet nature. My wealth was not in the coin I earned, but in the life that flourished around me, the buzz of pollinators in the squash blossoms, the lowing of healthy cattle, the gurgle of clean water over stone. The canyon was no longer the dust moor. It was haven. And as the years went on, I realized the most important thing he had left me was not a place, but a perspective. And so I leave this perspective to you. Look closely at the things your world has deemed worthless. Look at the empty lots, the abandoned projects, the ideas that everyone has dismissed as foolish. Look at the parts of yourself that you have been told are useless. What do they call your canyon? What is your dust moor? Do not be so quick to believe them. The world is full of hidden water, of secret paths, of seeds waiting for the right soil. The most valuable things are rarely the most obvious. The greatest strength is often forged in silence and solitude, built stone by stone while no one is watching. Do not be afraid of the descent. Do not be afraid of the hard work of chipping away at the rock that hides the source. For within that which is discarded, within that which is mocked, often lies the very thing you need to build a world. You just have to be willing to listen for it.